There were 28,000 government inventions sitting on the shelf. Less than 5% were licensed. And that's not commercialized, that's even licensed. And we also found out, to our shock, that not a single invention had been developed into a drug from NIH funding when the government took the patent rights away. So that's why I think Senator Bayh and Dole looked at this and said, listen, this may have been well intended, but this is a disaster.
Welcome to the Transfer Files, inside the world of federal innovation. This is your insider's look at how federal laboratories bring groundbreaking technologies to market. I'm your host, Andrea Nelson. In every episode, we'll bring you insights and expertise from throughout the world of tech transfer. One of the early and central policies that have shaped technology transfer is the Bayh-Dole Act, also known as the Patent and Trademark Law Amendments Act, passed in 1980. This law allows universities, businesses, and nonprofits to own inventions created through federally funded research. Today, I'm talking to Joe Allen, who was a staffer in Senator Birch Bayh's office, and he was key to getting the Bayh-Dole Act passed. 44 years later, he's still defending the policy as the executive director of the Bayh-Dole Coalition. So, Joe, let's start there. Where were you in your career when you started working on this issue? Did you have a business background?
First of all, I'm delighted to be with you today. And no, I didn't have a business background. I'm actually a history and English major. And I was on the Senate Judiciary. I was actually on a Senate Judiciary Subcommittee actually before I worked for Senator Bayh. And I was pretty low level. I was about as low level as you could be. I was a research assistant. And one of my jobs was to go through the Federal Register every day and find things that were relevant to the committee. And I also handled correspondence. So basically, in 1978, Senator Bayh became our chair, and he inherited me. And I think because I was so low level and inexpensive, they kept me on there. And so I was doing my job one day, and I actually found another issue. Because Senator Bayh was running for re-election. He's a senator from Indiana, where agriculture is very important. And at that time, we had an energy crisis, and gasoline was being rationed. So I actually stumbled into one of the Senate carpenters one day who had a sign called Gasohol. And I was talking to him, and he was talking about actually making ethanol from corn, and you could actually add it to gasoline. And I thought, well, that's a great issue because our farmers were looking for new markets. So I got on the issue and I staffed it up and wrote up an article. I wrote a thing and it went to Senator Bayh, and he loved it. And so that became one of the centers of his campaign. Unfortunately, I was on the Senate Judiciary Committee. So as soon as it became prominent, Senator Bayh's energy staffer took the issue away from me. So I was pretty crushed. I figured, I had my big chance. It'll never come back again. So I was sitting at my desk one day, and my general counsel, Nell Zackerson, came by and said, and he knew how I felt. And he said, hey, we've got Purdue coming in. Senator Bayh's office sent them down here to talk about some patent issue. Do you want to sit in? And I said, sure. So I went to his office, and we had Ralph Davis of Purdue, and he was accompanied by Norman Lacker, who was in the NIH Patent Council, and Howard Bremer, who worked at the Wisconsin Alumni Research Foundation. And what we found out was that Purdue had made an invention with DOE funding. And before Bayh-Dole, the government policy was if there was any percentage of federal funding, the invention was taken away from the inventor, taken to Washington, and made freely available, which seemed like a nice idea in 1945. But by 1970, the Japanese and the Germans were starting to eat our lunch, and the economy was in a tailspin. And we thought, well, that doesn't make any sense. So we found out through Norm Lacker that this is a big problem across the government. And Howard Bremer confirmed that. And so Nell Zackerson asked me to do some research on it, because, again, Senator Bayh, we always respected people coming in, but we also did due diligence. We didn't want to get Senator Bayh into an issue that really didn't make any sense. So long story short, I actually started doing research on it. I found out, in fact, it was a huge issue. And I sent it up, and Senator Bayh got interested in it. And then we found out by happenstance that Senator Dole was also interested, which is, to put it in perspective, it's very much like today. We're going into an election year. Bayh's a liberal Democrat, Dole's a conservative Republican. Bayh and Dole rarely agreed on anything. Now, they respected each other, but it's like you respect somebody in another team. I mean, these are serious players. So Senator Dole's office agreed to work with us, and the combination of Bayh and Dole became magical because, again, it was a bipartisan issue, and Bayh was very respected, Dole was respected, and I think also it's fair to say we respected Senator Dole because we knew he played fair. He played hard, he played to win, but you could deal with him. And Bayh and Dole liked each other personally, but again, it's sort of like you're on rival football teams. You may like the person personally, but you'll knock them on their butt if you're in the field. So anyway, the bill started going, and then Nels was invited to go down and speak to this university research group, which was actually the precursor of Autumn. And Nels hurt his back. So he called me and said, "Hey, would you go down and make this speech?" And I'd never spoken to anybody before. And I didn't know what did I know about this issue? I mean, I'd just done some research on it. So I had my little typewriter. This is before computers. And I typed up a little speech and went down to Atlanta. And it was the biggest meeting that the universities had ever had. They had 50 people in the room, which, of course, if you ever go to an autumn meeting now, there's thousands of there. But, we talked about the issue. They were very kind to me. They really said, "Hey, this is really an important issue." And so what happened was I wound up staffing Bayh-Dole. So it was all serendipity. Nels trusted me. He actually gave me a lot of guidance. But I literally just stumbled into this. So it wasn't anything that had some big career plan. And other thing I'll have to say is we had no idea if this is a big deal or not. I mean, Senator Bayh had a lot going on. He actually had 2 constitutional amendments. He did Title IX. I mean, he was, he did a lot. He had, he was very prominent, and he's running for re-election. So this was not like the only thing he's working on. Again, we really had no idea what a big deal this was. But as we got into it more and more, we realized, hey, this was a fundamental policy that was really harming America because you had billions of dollars of taxpayer funding and nothing was coming out of it. So we were literally giving our research away to our foreign competitors. They weren't stealing it. We were giving it away, but we weren't getting any benefits back. So that's maybe a long-winded answer to how I got into this thing, but it wasn't because of any master plan I had. It was just I was sitting at the right place one day, and I got a chance. And I guess the one lesson is for people that are just getting started in your careers, you never know when your big break is going to happen, and a lot of times it's completely unexpected. You don't even know it's a big break, but if you have an opportunity and you actually do your best, and you're lucky. It really can transform your life. And the other thing I'll say is the 3 people in that meeting became my mentors for my career. Norm Lacker and Howard Brimmer were really the pioneers of Bayh-Dole. They were real visionaries. And Nels Ackerson, Nels owed me nothing. He could have taken this issue. He was a general counsel, but he gave me a chance and he let me show what I could do. So, that my whole life changed. I'm still, even today, 43 years later, or 45 years later, I'm still working on the same issues. I'd never planned that. But again, you just never know when your life is going to change.
As you researched this issue that walked into your office, tell me more about what you found and why this issue stuck.
There was a scarlet letter attached to government funding. Companies were not going to fund research at a university or a federal laboratory for the simple reason that the government could take the invention away, even if it's a small percentage of the research. So we actually segregated our public and private sectors. Our best and brightest minds didn't work together because government money was tainted. And what we found was, as we started looking at Bayh-Dole, we asked the Comptroller General, "Hey, give us a report on this." So he reported to the Senate Judiciary Committee in our hearings. There were 28,000 government inventions sitting on the shelf. Less than 5% were licensed. And that's not commercialized, that's even licensed. And we also found out, to our shock, that not a single invention had been developed into a drug from NIH funding when the government took the patent rights away. So that's why I think Senator Bayh and Dole looked at this and said, listen, this may have been well-intended, but this is a disaster. And again, remember, most of you may not have been born in the 1970s, but in the 1970s, the industrial might in the United States, the Midwest, which overwhelmed Hitler and Japan, was called the Rust Belt. We were losing manufacturing to Germany. We were losing technology to Japan. And the Japanese were openly sending search teams into our federal laboratories and universities looking for new leads because we were giving them away. So Bayh and Dole said, this can't continue. And actually, our first press conference on the law was we actually had some researchers whose inventions were being held up by NIH. And they came in and talked about cancer therapies, burn therapies. And that just had a storm of people, co-sponsors. In fact, I well remember shortly after that press conference, we picked up two new co-sponsors. One was Senator Ted Kennedy, who actually chaired the Senate Judiciary Committee, and the other was Strom Thurmond. And they were that's like picking up Ted Cruz and Bernie Sanders. So I, as a young staffer, I went hurrying down to the Senate floor, went up to Senator Bayh. He was sitting at his desk, doing some business, waiting for a bill to come up. And I said, Senator, great news. We just picked up Ted Kennedy and Strom Thurmond. I'll never forget. He had his reading glasses on. He pulled them down a little bit and looked at me with this wry smile and said, "Are you sure this bill makes any sense?" And we both had to laugh because you just didn't pick up political combinations like that. But the other thing that Senator Bayh never told me until years later was his wife had malignant breast cancer, and she was at NIH and she was getting treatments. And Marvella Bayh loved NIH. She was really respectful when she got there. And Senator Bayh never told me this during the hearings. But Mrs. Bayh said, there's important technologies out here that could keep other people from doing what I'm going through. So he actually had a personal cause for this. But again, Birch Bayh was not the kind of person he would not be somebody who would be on Facebook sharing all of his personal feelings. And again, he never told me that as a staffer, but he knew personally, this is just more than an esoteric issue. This is people's lives. And again, for the researchers out there, what's more frustrating than you may have a cure for cancer or help somebody with serious disformities? And it's a research paper. It can't even benefit anybody. So anyway, that's what really got the ball rolling. And only by the grace of God, I was there and able to do something to help it.
Even when you got all these stars to align, the bill faced some incredible hurdles. Can you describe some of the major challenges the bill had to overcome?
It was almost like the Lord of the Rings. Basically, as you said very well, there were people in it, and still are people, that really believe if the government funds research, it should be available for everyone for free. And again, I don't dislike people because of that, but the fact is it just doesn't work. But the other thing was Bayh-Dole, there have been a number of attempts to have patent policy bills passed before, and they all failed. So when we looked at this, we said, look, the crux of the problem is universities and small companies. Because DOD, even before Bayh-Dole, a lot of times you give their big prime contractors rights to inventions. So we said, look, the people that we need to they're really feeling the most harm are universities. And a lot of small companies, entrepreneurial small companies, would not even take a government grant or contract. They couldn't afford to because they would lose any commercial rights. So we focused on universities and small companies. So when we started the bill, we had people like Hyman Rickover, who was the father of the nuclear navy, who again, in nuclear reactors, commercialization and patents are not a big issue. So he said, hey, patents aren't important. You don't have to worry about that. From my experience, it doesn't work. And Senator Bayh was very respectful for him. But Senator Russell Long, who chaired the Senate Finance Committee, was somebody that actually listened to Hyman Rickover. So we had that opposition. The other thing we had was, as we started to get the ball rolling, the Senate Commerce Committee, which had also looked at patent policy, started presenting, I think, what we were doing. And so, we had to get the bill through the Senate Judiciary Committee. We did. And we had Senator Long. We knew it was going to be a problem. Well, out of the blue, right before the bill came up, Senator Stevenson, who actually did Stevenson-Weidler, and the chairman of and Senator Cannon, who actually chaired the Commerce Committee, offered an amendment on the floor to actually include big business in the Bayh-Dole Act. And the Carter administration, I'll have to back up a minute. The day before we had a hearing, this bill's been introduced for a year. We actually put the bill in 1978 to get comments. And we sent it down to the Carter administration. Didn't hear a word back. So I'm in my office the day before the hearings, I'm over a year later, and the Carter administration comes in and says, hey, we're not ready. Can you postpone your hearing? And I said, no, we're not going to postpone the hearing. We've been waiting for you for a year. If you ever come up with a conclusion, let us know. Well, the Carter administration went off and developed their own policy, and they were working with the Senate Commerce Committee. So anyway, we're down on the Senate floor. We're finally getting ready to debate the bill. We're in an election year, just like now. So time is critical. There's not a bunch of time for a patent bill. And we start to debate it. And Senator Stevenson and Cannon floated a dear colleague letter saying that they're going to try to amend Bayh-Dole to include big business, which we knew this was a kiss of death because we couldn't possibly get that across the finish line. We knew Russell Long would kill it. So Bayh sends out a letter, says we can't accept this amendment. and we actually voted down. As soon as we voted down, Senator Long comes steaming out of the cloakroom. He actually sat right behind Birch Bayh. So I was sitting beside Senator Bayh on the Senate floor, and Russell Long murmurs, "This is the worst thing I've ever seen in my life." And so he tells the president of the Senate, "I have a number of amendments to offer. This is going to take a long time." So they pull Bayh-Dole off the floor. So we're devastated, and it took us months and months and months to get it back on. I'll have to say that I had a very good relationship with Senator Long's staffer, a guy named Wiley Jones. And this is how the Senate used to work. We agreed, okay, listen, we're not going to sandbag each other. I'll tell you what we're doing. And Wiley said, I'll tell you what we're doing, which didn't mean he wasn't going to oppose us, but, we're going to play fair. So we finally reached an agreement with Wiley. We said, listen, we're not going to make this a big business bill. We know you have problems with the other thing, but Senator Long said, okay, I don't really like this, but I'll let it go. So the Senate passes Bayh-Dole, I think 95-4. Senator Long voted no. We go over to the House side. The House side starts accepting the administration bill. And so now we're down into the almost right before the election, and we're at an impasse. Because I basically told the House counterparts, I said, listen, we can't accept this bill. It's not going to go. Russell Long can kill it, and he will kill it. And we've given him our word we're not going to do that. So we have an impasse. So then we had the election of 1980, and Senator Bayh's up for election. And I was sitting with my son, who was then about 5 years old, and we're watching the CBS News. At that time, there was no cable. There's only like 3 big channels. I'm watching CBS News. About 7 o'clock, the first returns are coming in, and Walter Cronkite says, Indiana has gone for Ronald Reagan over Jimmy Carter, and Birch Bayh has lost. So my boss has just lost the election. And I'm sitting there, and my son, who knows something bad's happened, but is not really sure what it is, he looks at me and says, Dad, does that mean I don't get an allowance? And I was like, well, it could, because I don't have a job anymore. The Senate changes hands from Democrat to Republican. The Carter administration is going out. The Reagan administration is coming in. But Congress hadn't passed the budget, which is sort of typical. So they had to have a lame duck session. So we come back in, Senator Bayh still in office until January, and I finally get a call from my counterpart in the House. And the University of Wisconsin was in Congressman Kastenmeier's district, who was our counterpart. And the University of Wisconsin, Howard Brimmer, made it clear to Kastenmeier, hey, this is a critical thing for the university. We really need to get this legislation through. So they offered me a deal. They said, okay, we'll take Bayh-Dole. There's other parts of a patent bill. If you'll take the other parts, we'll send a bill over with Bayh-Dole in it. You accept it, and then we'll be done. So I went to Senator Bayh. He said, great deal. So that's it. The House does what they said they're going to do. They pass the bill with Bayh-Dole in it, comes over to the Senate. Well, we're in the lame duck session, so the only bills that will be considered are things that will be passed on unanimous consent. In other words, any senator who votes no, the bill's dead. So the Senate Majority Leader, Senator Birch, had to clear it. You basically go through and say, does anybody have an objection? And I get a call from Senator Birch's staffer, and they said, there's a hold on your bill. Now, under the Senate rules, any senator can say, I object to this being considered, and you don't have to say who it was. So I immediately called Wiley Jones. I said, hey, did Senator Long put a hold on the bill? He said no. So I'm thinking, who could it be? And no one's going to tell me. So I get a feeling I know who it is. And I went down to the Senate cafeteria, and I found Senator Stevenson's staffer there. Now, Stevenson Weidler is also pending in the lame duck session. So he's having lunch, and I can be pretty obnoxious. And I walked up to him and said, hey, listen, I understand there's a hold on our bill, and I don't know who did it, but I'm telling you, I'm putting a hold on everything with your boss's name on it until that hold is lifted. And I walked away. So about half an hour later, I get a call from the Majority Leader. Hey, the hold's been lifted. And so I said, great. But then they said, but we're going to have to run this by Senator Long again, just to make sure, because we can't waste time if this is going to be held up. So I get a call back from my friend Wiley Jones. He says, I got 2 questions for you. One's from Senator Long and one's from me. And I said, great. He said, okay, the first one's for me. Is it better for you, Joe Allen, if we kill this bill so you can get a job next year and come back? So again, he's doing something for my personal benefit. And this is a guy who I've been fighting with. He said, is it better for you as a staffer if we kill this thing so maybe you can come up with somebody else? I said, listen, Wiley, I appreciate that, but it's now or never. He said, okay, great. The second question is from Senator Long. Does Birch really want this bill? And I said, yes, he really does. So Wiley says, thank you very much. He hangs up. 5 minutes later, Senator Bayh's phone rings. It's Russell Long. He says, Birch, I'm really going to miss working with you, and you can have your damn patent bill. And that's how Bayh-Dole was passed. But that's not the end, because Congress adjourns. Under the Constitution, if the president doesn't sign a bill within 7 working days after Congress adjourns, it's pocket veto. In other words, it's not a bill. So the Department of Energy, bless their little hearts, didn't like Bayh-Dole because DOE had a whole bureaucracy on case-by-case reviews. They had more lawyers doing that than GM had as patent attorneys. So we start getting calls that, hey, listen, they're trying to work to have the president veto the bill. And because Bayh-Dole included small companies, the Small Business Administration was one of our big allies. So the last possible day, Jimmy Carter signed Bayh-Dole. So it couldn't have been cut more closely. But even that's not the end of the story, because after you pass a bill, you have to have regulations. Well, Birch Bayh's gone. So DOE decides they're going to undermine the Bayh-Dole implementing regulations. And I don't want to get into the whole saga there, but Norm Lacker had been fired by NIH for working with Birch Bayh. And Bayh and Dole said, you're not going to fire him. So we actually got him put back into the Small Business Administration. Later, he went to the Office of Management and Budget. So we put Bayh-Dole regulations under Office of Management and Budget because Norm could do it. So Norm Lacker, and he later moved to Commerce, which is why oversight's now at Commerce. But Norm Lacker spent 2 years fighting to get the implementing regulations in place, because if the implementing regulations were undermined, Bayh-Dole wouldn't work. So this was a long, hard fight. And it really wasn't until 1982, 2 years after passage, that the implementing regulations were in place. And ironically, President Reagan endorsed Bayh-Dole once he got in office. He liked Bayh-Dole, so he basically said, hey, we're cutting off this bureaucratic infighting. You will get these regulations through the way they're supposed to be. And so I have a whole paper about this, the story about what happened between Bayh-Dole and the Federal Tech Transfer Act. But this was anything but easy and anything but a slam dunk.
Around this time, were there sort of 2 parallel conversations or efforts, one on the university research side and one on the federal side?
That's a great point. I mean, there was an evolution. And I'll have to add, when I was doing my staff work for Senator Bayh, I looked at the other patent bills that haven't passed. And one was a Congressman Thornton on the House Science Committee. It had, I thought, a pretty good bill. So I looked at it, and part of his bill was actually with the federal laboratory. So actually, I took the end part of Senator Thornton's bill and added it to Bayh-Dole. So if you look at the end of Bayh-Dole, that's where it came from. So what happened was, we passed Bayh-Dole in 1980, and federal labs were licensing before that, but it was very rare. What happened was, I think it was 1982, the Office of Federal Personnel Policy made a ruling that agencies didn't have the authority to retain royalties or pay their inventors. And those are key things of Bayh-Dole, because that's the incentive for you to actually manage the technology. So that kind of knocked the props out of the Bayh-Dole regime. What happened was Senator Dole was in the Senate Judiciary Committee at that time. So he drafted an amendment to Bayh-Dole to cover that for federal laboratories. And that later became the Federal Technology Transfer Act, but it was originally part of Bayh-Dole. What happened was the House didn't have a counterpart to it. And actually, I was at the Commerce Department then, so we were working with Senator Dole. He asked us for our assistance, nothing untoward about it. And so we went over and talked to the House Science and Tech people. And I said, well, listen, we can take most of Senator Dole's amendment, but we don't have anything like this, this laboratory part. So they said, we'll defer on that. Shortly after that, Senator Dole left the Judiciary Committee and became the Senate Majority Leader. So what happened was Senator Slade Gorton of Washington then picked up the mantle, and he contacted our office and said, hey, listen, I'm not on Judiciary Committee. Can you rewrite this thing so it amends Stevenson-Weidler, which falls under Commerce Committee, not Bayh-Dole? So when people think of the Federal Tech Transfer Act, it's really not separate from Bayh-Dole. It's only by happenstance it's on Stevenson-Weidler, which ironically Senator Stevenson's tried to kill Bayh-Dole, as opposed to Bayh-Dole. But you're exactly right. What happened was, in addition to the OFPP thing, it really became apparent pretty quickly Bayh-Dole had made a huge impact. And as I mentioned, Ronald Reagan actually made, under a presidential memorandum executive order, he made Bayh-Dole a centerpiece of his administration policy. And he asked David Packard, a business person, why are we getting the same impact out of federal laboratories? So the Packard report, which I think is actually, again, on our website, really talked about the same authorities aren't in federal laboratories as there are universities. So that's really why we did the Federal Tech Transfer Act. And ironically, there was a lot of dispute about that because Procter and Gamble was afraid that if we rewarded federal inventors, that might be made as a precedent. The Germans have a law where basically they require companies to reward their employed inventors. And Procter and Gamble was afraid that if we paid federal employees, that could be a precedent. So they persuaded the House side to take out the royalty sharing for federal inventors. And we said, it doesn't work that way. So the trade-off was Senator Gordon agreed that he would accept a full charter for the FLC, because before that, the FLC only had a 5-year authorization. Senator Gordon said, okay, I'll take a full charter for the FLC if you'll accept royalty sharing for federal laboratories and federal employees. So actually, you benefited both ways, but that's actually how that deal was done. That's why you have a full charter. You're not going back every 5 years to get reauthorized.
Well, I have to say thank you for the FLC charter.
We were happy to do that because we have a lot of respect for the Federal Lab Consortium, but these were not simple issues. And again, you may think, well, that's really crazy, but this was all new. So it's easy to look back now, but again, if you go back then, you could actually understand people think, well, does this really make sense or not? But again, without royalty sharing, there's no one's, before Bayh-Dole, for the Tech Transfer Act, the agencies would assume the expenses of tech transfer, but the benefits went back to the Treasury Department. So who's going to do that? And what federal scientist is going to spend? Again, federal scientists aren't really paid to invent things. They're paid to do research. So why would they be working on inventions if it looked like there was no benefits to them? It's actually taking away from what they're being paid to do. So, one of the things that Bayh-Dole is, you have to put the authorities and incentives in there, because commercializing technologies is not what universities are charged to do. It's not what their researchers are charged to do, or federal laboratories. This is actually serendipity at no cost to the American taxpayer. But without this, you don't get the benefits back. You have research papers, but you don't have real products.
In the past 44 years since the bill has passed, what are some of the main policies that have reinforced or chipped away at Bayh-Dole?
You still have the same opposition out there. And I think, one thing that we can't neglect is we have to educate people. It's not that people are stupid, but this is an issue that most people don't know much about. So you have to really explain to people how Bayh-Dole works and what the risk is of developing technologies. The Chinese understand Bayh-Dole. They tried to copy it. I became a consultant after I left. I ran a thing called the National Technology Transfer Center. And one of the first calls I got was from South Africa. South Africa adopted a Bayh-Dole Act. They asked me to come over there. I thought I was actually giving a talk to universities. I was actually the first witness testifying before their parliament, much to my surprise. But I've flown 17 hours. I was going to do it. So I think it's really clear that Bayh-Dole works. The other thing which we didn't anticipate, when I think is just wonderful, is it shows how decentralized technology management is such a genius. We didn't envision in 1980s companies spinning out of universities, but that's become one of the drivers of the U.S. economy. And again, we certainly would like to have that at federal laboratories, but we're the only country in the world that's actually driven by entrepreneurial small companies. Even in drug development, 50% of our drugs come out of small companies. People don't realize that. Now, a lot of these companies fail, maybe get acquired, but that's what drives the U.S. economy. So I think one of the other differences, in 1980, Bayh-Dole was a theory. We could say, hey, look, what's going right now doesn't work. Now, because we actually have data showing, the trillions of dollars of impact on the U.S. economy, millions of jobs created. When I was at the Commerce Department, we had the CIA come in and gave me a classified briefing. And what it showed was, of the 10 top technologies of the world, we'd already lost our lead in 3, and we're expected to lose our lead in 5 more in just a couple of years. That didn't happen. And the reason it didn't happen was Bayh-Dole ignited a unprecedented renaissance of American innovation, because for the first time, our public and private sectors were working together. And we recaptured the lead in every technology. In fact, just think of what happened 3 years ago. We had the COVID pandemic. Most of the world is shut down. People are sitting at their home, afraid to even go outside. But our universities, our federal labs, and our companies worked around the clock during the pandemic. And they came up with amazing therapies and vaccines in record time. I mean, Operation Warp Speed was a miracle. I mean, nothing that had ever happened before in life sciences. And we literally saved the world.
As we wrap up, the FLC, as you probably know, is celebrating its 50th anniversary this year. So we've been in sort of a reflective mood. You've been around tech transfer for most of that 50 years. And so knowing that history and looking forward, what should people who are in the tech transfer ecosystem today bear in mind as we move into the future?
I think we should actually, despite what I just said, we should be very optimistic because what we've proven is the theory works. And I think it's never been more important for the private sector to partner with federal laboratories and universities because you complement their expertise. You don't replicate it, you complement each other. And again, without the government, without the industry people, all this government research is just basically theories and papers without any practical application. So you really need each other. And I think, again, the thing that's so exciting is the genius of decentralized management is you have the authority to do things which haven't been done before. And that's what's really exciting. Bayh-Dole says if a university or federal lab or a small company made the invention, you manage it. So you decide. You know more about this than anybody in Washington. You decide what makes the most sense. And again, we're the only country in the world that actually has that decentralization. And again, if somebody gets something wrong, it's not fatal. Then people learn from it and go on. Under centralization, if something goes wrong, it is fatal. The whole system is tainted. So we're able to run a number of experiments and see consortia, whatever spin-off companies, all these things are things that really make sense in some situations, but you don't have somebody dictating you, this is how you have to do it. So I think the other critical thing is to the FLC, just like the Bayh-Dole Coalition, don't neglect to explain the basics. You can't assume people know this stuff because they don't. Most people have no idea how the system works. They don't even know there is a system. They see benefits out of it, but they hear people saying, well, you're being abused. People are taking advantage of government taxpayers. Things should be cheaper. Things should be free. You have to explain the reality of technology commercialization because the heroes of Bayh-Dole are not universities. They're not federal laboratories. They're entrepreneurs who take a risk, and they take that knowing the odds are it won't pay off. But they still do that because they're driven by a passion. And that passion is what moves our system. And you have passionate researchers, just like I mentioned, the Dennis Liotta at Emory, who helped come up with the AIDS cocktail. Before that, AIDS was fatal. If you had AIDS, you had a couple months to live, and it was a nasty, nasty death. Now, because of our research scientists in the public and private sectors, you can live with AIDS your whole life. Now, it's not a cure for AIDS yet, but it's come a long way in 20 years. And I think that's what that's what drives your federal scientists. But without the tech transfer people, these are research papers and theories. They don't have any practical application to anybody. And we really can't forget that you are the stewards of the public sector. You represent the interests of the taxpayers. And I think I'm really proud of the work the federal laboratories and universities have done because the trust we had in Bayh-Dole says you can do this, but it doesn't guarantee success. You've shown that the theory works. So really because of you folks and the university people and the small business people, Bayh-Dole's a success, not because of me, not because of Birch Bayh or Bob Dole, God love them. They took a risk. They took a chance on this. But the only reason it paid off is people took those responsibilities. They've done the law the way we thought to do. We've been very, very responsible. And the benefits have been tremendous.
Joe Allen, thank you so much for being with us and for sharing your experience and your insights.
And happy birthday, FLC.
Thanks for tuning in to the Transfer Files, your insider's look at federal tech transfer. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and stay connected for more episodes exploring how hundreds of government laboratories and countless industry partners are driving innovations that shape our lives.